Hi, Kicken. How are you doing? How was your weekend? Oh, and did you say that you were going to be doing the campaign with your family this weekend, or was that coming up? And how was it? I know that's like a million questions. Sorry. Oh, okay. Uh, I'm sorry that it was boring. Was it just boring with a lot of homework, or did you like play some games or something like that? Oh, and I'll switch screens. Look at what I did. I should have done this. Oh, nice. Find some new, good new channels or anything like that. Look at what I did, and which I should have done with the Frederick Douglass novel. I've got a little content warning thing. Let me. Yeah, there we go. That's centered better. Thank you. Yeah, when that person came in the middle of one of those characters' tirades last time, like, oh no, I should have had something there to say content warning, but I failed. Well, if you have some like great YouTube channels that always have good content up, you don't need to find new channels. I hardly ever find any new channels. Basically, my sister and I watch Rooster Teeth and Devin But Better and Kitchen and Jorn. Kitchen and Jorn and Devin But Better were a part of another show that used to be, well, another show on BuzzFeed, but since they left BuzzFeed, these are their sort of their individual channels, and they're fun. I like them. Rooster Teeth always has some fun stuff. Like, I love the ones where they play Raft, and they're so ridiculous. There is the dad of the group, and he's like, look at all of this good organization that I've done. Now you do this job and you do that job, and then you've got the guy who acts like a large child, just like, I'm gonna do my own thing. Hey, I'm captain now. Blah blah blah. They're ridiculous. Pirate part of the campaign. Oh, okay. You're doing the island idea and progressing it to be an open world. Ooh. That will be interesting, like having a D&D open world sandbox. Are you going to have like set NPCs that they might come across, or are you going to kind of roll to see what NPCs might crop up? 4 big bad evil guys terrorizing the land. Oh, nice. Yeah, they are funny. They've been doing a lot more like of the, not really play-alongs, but they've been doing a lot more. You watch them collaboratively playing a game since the quarantine, which totally makes sense. They haven't been doing hardly any RT life. RT shorts, definitely. Like, there have been 2, I think. Nice. And some of my, there's some old RT Lives that my sister and I will just go back and watch for fun, like the one where they go to Buc-ee's and buy the girls' presents. And Buc-ee's is, apparently, I've never been there myself, but it is this enormous gas station down in Texas. And the The gas station store is like a supermarket. It's so big. That and their lost hide and seek, that's what it's called. Where Chris is it and everybody's hiding from him and he has like 20 minutes or something like that to find them. It's pretty fun. Well, shall we get started? So this book, The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, is a book that I read in college in my American literature class. And it was very interesting. Preface to, oh, okay, there is actually a preface to the 1912 edition that the publishers printed with the book. Oh, random fact. Thank you very much, Pete. How are you doing? By the way, Kickin', I don't remember if I told you or not, but I bought a whole new book filled with random facts, so it's going to take you quite a while to hear all of them. All right, pick a number between 1 and 300? Yeah, 1 and 300. $264. Alrighty, let's find out what's on 264. I was be smart. I like that other people say smart. That's something that my sister and I say. Alright, 164. Some interesting new words. Mundungus, the stench of tobacco. Quaquiversal, going off in all directions. Interesting. Pixelated, slightly mad or confused, having been led astray by pixies. Oh, okay, I gotcha. Rascetta or Raschetta, I'm not really sure. Rasceta. The creases on the inside of the wrist. Oh, those have terms. That's really crazy. Huh. I love random facts, random, new, bizarre, out there words. Thank you for redeeming the random facts, Kickin'. And oh, and PT. What was your number, Kickin'? Or shall I just pick a page? $420. I can't. It doesn't go up to $420, my dear. I could do $210 and just say that's $420. Sure, we'll do $210. Say that's $420. Okay. Since 1700, new beetle species have been discovered at the rate of 1 every 6 hours. Holy cow. The short-circuit beetle is so named because it eats the lead coverings of telephone cables. Oh no! Actually, Pete, there is a funny story about knitting needles. My current character that I'm playing in D&D uses knitting as a way to like chill out, like come down from after a battle and just kind of relax. And so she has used her knitting needles successfully in campaigns, like in not really in battles, although there was one time she did use it in the heat of battle and it turned out well. But she's used it to unpick a lock that neither of the rogues could unlock. She managed to get out some jewelry from a really, really thin crevice in a wall. And then my most proud moment with that knitting needle was when she tied a cord of braided wool to the end, threw it up like a grappling hook, and then it it kind of slammed into the edge of the cave, and she used that to climb up Successfully. She did this successfully. I rolled natural 20s on all of these cases, and everybody else is just looking on like, what in the world is up with these knitting needles? What can I say? She's a knight in training. And the wondrous knitting needles, yes. What are you knitting, by the way, Pete? I would love to hear. And put on up pictures. You are on the Discord, right? Yes, you are. But love to see some pictures on the Discord. Okay. We're doing 210. Cartwrightia cartwrighti is a scarab beetle described by Oscar L. Cartwright. As you are not supposed to name a species after yourself, he claimed to have named it after his brother. And then death watch beetles attract mates by repeatedly banging their heads on the door. Ooh, a Pokeball. Nice. I would love to see it. Is it going to be like something for you to store stuff in, or is it just like an amigurumi thing? Which I need to remember to take a picture. My sister for Christmas made me 2 amigurumi mushrooms and then a little amigurumi triceratops, because those are my favorite dinosaurs. That would be fun, kickin'. If we can figure out a time when everybody, or when enough people are there, we should definitely do a Discord D&D campaign. And I think I do have Tabletop Simulator, and I know some people use that for online campaigns. And I know that, oh, and welcome to the Discord, Pete. Thank you so much. And I know that Corel knows a lot of online resources that we could use as well. Oh, that's right. Amigurumi or crochet. Okay. Well, you could use, if it's a flat Pokeball, you could use it as like a trivet or pot holder. I know. It's both really awesome and also frustrating as well, because, I mean, it's really awesome that, like, can you imagine 100 years ago people thinking that we could have a conversation with 4 or 5 people from all different time zones? I mean, 2 people at different time zones, because, I mean, they did have telephones back then. Oh. Just single-pointed needles. Yeah, okay, gotcha. Oh, the 3.5 probably. 3.5 is probably the most popularly used one of the old ones. I know that they have released some of the handbook, I think. And Pathfinder is actually how I started playing, excuse me, is how I started playing D&D. And it's sort of a D&D offshoot, because they took 3.5 D&D and they sort of expanded on it, adjusted some rules. And so you can get definitely more specific with the things that you want to learn. Like if you wanted to you get a certain amount of points that you can use to raise your level or raise your rolls in certain things like perception and languages and, stuff like that. Like I had one character that I wanted her to learn every single language. She got pretty close. She got, oh goodness, I don't remember how many languages she could speak, and she got to about level 11, so you can imagine. Okay, I gotcha. Now my sister did a mushroom, like a 3D mushroom. Uh-oh. No. Nightbot, what did you do? I'm sorry, I haven't figured out how to do The Nightbot thing. Hang on a second. No. Cancel. I guess if you put some words with the emotes, that's so frustrating. I'm sorry. Those are cute emotes. Oh my gosh, I love that one with all the exclamation points, not marks, points. Ah, there we go. Got those. All right, we should probably get started. So, yes, I did read this when I was, goodness, I think I was 21 at the time. And I'm 40 now, but I've always remembered this book. So when I saw that this was a possibility, I was stoked. So I don't really remember if there was anything like content-wise that would be upsetting. We'll see. I have the content warning up there anyways. So here we go. And there is a preface to the 1912 edition, which I will be reading. So here, let's start. So this is written by the publishers at the time. This vivid and startlingly new picture of conditions brought about by the race question in the United States makes no special plea for the Negro, but shows in a dispassionate, though sympathetic manner conditions as they actually exist between the whites and blacks today. 1912 today. Special pleas have already been made for and against the Negroes in hundreds of books, but in these books either his virtue or his vices have been exaggerated. This is because writers, in nearly every instance, have treated the colored American as a whole. Each has taken one group of the race to prove his case. Not before has a composite and proportionate presentation of the entire race, embracing all of its various groups and elements, showing their relations with each other and to the whites, have been made. It is very likely that the Negroes of the United States have a fairly correct idea of what the white people of the country think of them, for that opinion has for a long time been and is still being constantly stated. But they are themselves more or less a sphinx to the whites. It is curiously interesting and even vitally important to know what are the thoughts of 10 millions of them concerning the people among whom they live. In these pages, it is as though a veil has been drawn aside. The reader is given a view of the inner life of the Negro in America, and initiated into the Freemasonry, as it were, of the race. These people also reveal the unsuspected fact that prejudice against the Negro is exerting a pressure which, in New York and other large cities where the opportunity is open, is actually and constantly forcing an unascertainable number of fair-complexioned colored people over into the white race. In this book, the reader is given a glimpse behind the scenes of this race drama, which is being here enacted. He is taken upon an elevation where he can catch a bird's-eye view of the conflict which is being waged. The publishers. Yeah, I know. There were several different people who, like in The Heroic Slave, the narrator of the book is a white abolitionist, and so, he and a lot of other people, especially from the North, but there were some in the South as well, were very passionately helping the slaves who would try to escape slavery, and it was a collaborative thing. The Underground Railroad, there were families who would host people as they were fleeing up north from the place in the South. There was the Mason-Dixon line, which was once you crossed that invisible line, but people pretty much knew where it was. You felt you were home free. You were still in the United States, and it was still, I don't think that they had specifically laws to say that some people were free in some places, some people were free in another. So that's why in The Heroic Slave he escaped to Canada. And when he commandeered the boat at the end, he directed them to take the ship to a British community in the Bahamas, because Britain had in 1933, and that was several years before the United States did and before the Civil War, they had passed the law that slavery was, it was not a thing. People are not property. And so, since he knew that, and he was a very smart guy, it's based on a true story, too. That's why they went to the British owned at the time Bahamas. So very interesting. Ooh, my sister's cooking something and it smells delicious. But that will be for another time. Okay, let's get started. The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man by James Weldon Johnson. Chapter 1. I know that in writing the following pages I am divulging the great secret of my life, the secret which for some years I have guarded far more carefully than any of my earthly possessions, and it is a curious study to me to analyze the motives which prompt me to do it. I feel that I am led by the same impulse which forces the unfound-out criminal to take everybody into his confidence, although he knows that the act is liable, even almost certain, to lead to his undoing. I know that I am playing with fire, and I feel the thrill which accompanies that most fascinating pastime. And back of it all, I think I find a sort of savage and diabolical desire to gather up all the little tragedies of my life and turn them into a practical joke on society. And too, I suffer a vague feeling of unsatisfaction, of regret, of almost remorse, from which I am seeking relief, and of which I shall speak in the last paragraph of this account. I was born in a little town of Georgia a few years after the closure of the Civil War. I shall not mention the name of the town, because there are people still living there who could be connected with this narrative. I have only a faint recollection of the place of my birth. At times, I can close my eyes and call up in a dreamlike way things that seem to have happened long ago, ages ago, in some other world. I can see in this half vision a little house. I'm quite sure it was not a large one. I can remember that flowers grew in the front yard, and that around each bed of flowers was a hedge of varicolored glass bottles stuck in the ground neck down. I remember that once, while playing around in the sand, I became curious to know whether or not the bottles grew as the flowers did, and I proceeded to dig them up to find out. The investigation brought me a terrific spanking, which indelibly fixed the incident in my mind. I can remember, too, that behind the house was a shed under which stood 2 or 3 wooden wash tubs. These tubs were the earliest aversion of my life, for regularly on certain evenings I was plunged into one of them and scrubbed until my skin ached. I can remember to this day the pain caused by the strong, rank soap getting into my eyes. Back from the house, a vegetable garden ran, perhaps 75 or 100 feet, but to my childish fancy, it was an endless territory. Oh, hey, Nightmare, good to see you. Thanks for joining me. We just started. We're a page in. I can still recall the thrill of joy, excitement, and wonder it gave me to go on an exploring expedition through it, to find the blackberries, both ripe and green, that grew along the edge of the fence. I remember that what pleasure I used to arrive at and stand before a little enclosure in which stood a patient cow chewing her cud, how I would occasionally offer her through the bars a piece of my bread and molasses, and how I would jerk back my hand and half fright if she made any motion to accept my offer. I have a dim recollection of several people who moved in and about this little house, but I have a distinct mental image of only two. One, my mother, and the other, a tall man with a small dark mustache. I remember that his shoes or boots were always shiny, and that he wore a gold chain and great gold watch with which he was always willing to let me play. My admiration was almost equally divided between the watch and chain and the shoes. He used to come to the house evenings. He used to come to the house evenings, perhaps 2 or 3 times a week, and it became my appointed duty whenever he came to bring him a pair of slippers and to put the shiny shoes in a particular corner. He often gave me in return for this service a bright coin which my mother taught me promptly drop in a little tin bank. I remember distinctly the last time this tall man came to the little house in Georgia. That evening before I went to bed, he took me up in his arms and squeezed me very tightly. My mother stood behind his chair, wiping tears from her eyes. I remember how I sat upon his knee and watched him laboriously drill a hole through a $10 gold piece, and then tie the coin around my neck with a string. I have worn that gold piece around my neck the greater part of my life, and still possess it, but more than once I have wished that some other way had been found of attaching it to me besides putting a hole through it. On the day after the coin was put around my neck, my mother and I started on what seemed to me an endless journey. I knelt on the seat and watched through the train window the corn and cotton fields pass swiftly by until I fell asleep. When I fully awoke, we were being driven through the streets of a large city, Savannah. I sat up and blinked at the bright lights. At Savannah, we boarded a steamer, which finally landed us in New York. From New York, we went to a town in Connecticut, which became the home of my boyhood. My mother and I lived together in a little cottage which seemed to me to be fitted up almost luxuriously. There were horsehair-covered chairs in the parlor, and a little square piano. There was a stairway with red carpet on it leading to a half-second story. There were pictures on the walls and a few books in a glass-doored case. My mother dressed me very neatly, and I developed that pride which well-dressed boys generally have. She was careful about my associates, and I myself was quite particular. As I look back now, I can see that I was a perfect little aristocrat. My mother rarely went to anyone's home, but she did sewing, and there were a great many ladies coming to our cottage. If I were around, they would generally call me and ask me my name and age, and tell my mother what a pretty boy I was. Some of them would pat me on the head and kiss me. My mother was kept very busy with her sewing. Sometimes she would have another woman helping her. I think she must have derived a fair income from her work. What's up, Maestro? Hi. You gonna join me? Sorry, Maestro and Cruz are just, hi. You sit in my lap, or you're just gonna be a nuisance? You're interrupting story time. He'll probably settle down soon. My mother was kept very busy with her sewing. Sometimes she would have another woman helping her. I think she must have derived a fair income from her work. I know, too, that at least once each month she received a letter. I used to watch for the postman, get the letter, and run to it with her. Whether she was busy or not, she would take it and instantly thrust it into her bosom. I never saw her read one of them. I knew later that these letters contained money, and what was to her more than money. Hi, come on. Are you going to sit in my lap? Sorry, sometimes he gets it into his head, but he is going to snag my bun and pull me back to him and nuzzle. But now he's just being indecisive. Maestro, come on. In my lap, or leave me alone. Those are your 2 choices. Well, then I'm going to ignore you if you're not going to make up your mind. As busy as she As busy as she generally was, she, however, found time to teach me my letters and figures and how to spell a number of easy words. Always on Sunday evenings, she opened the little square piano and picked out hymns. I can recall now that whenever she played hymns from the book, her tempos were always decidedly largo. Sometimes, on other evenings, when she was not sewing, she would play simple accompaniments. I've always had trouble with this word, accompaniments, to some old Southern songs which she sang. In these songs, she was freer, because she played them by ear. Those evenings on which she opened the little piano were the happiest hours of my childhood. Whenever she started towards the instrument, I used to follow her with all the interest and irrepressible joy that a pampered pet dog shows when a package is opened in which he knows there is a sweet bit for him. I used to stand by her side and often interrupt and annoy her by chiming in with strange harmonies which I found either on the high keys or the treble or low keys of the bass. I remember that I had a particular fondness for the black keys. Always on such evenings, when the music was over, my mother would sit with me in her arms, often for a very long time. She would hold me close, softly crooning some old melody without words, all the while gently stroking her face against my head. Many and many a night I thus fell asleep. I can see her now, her great dark eyes looking into the fire. To where? No one knew but she. The memory of that picture has more than once kept me from straying too far from the place of purity and safety in which her arms held me. At a very early age, I began to thump on the piano alone, and it was not long before I was able to pick out a few tunes. When I was 7 years old, I could play it by ear, all the hymns and songs that my mother knew. I had also learned the names of the notes in both clefs, but I preferred not to be hampered by notes. About this time, several ladies for whom my mother sewed heard me play, and they persuaded her that I should at once be put under a teacher, so arrangements were made for me to study the piano with a lady who was a fairly good musician. At the same time, arrangements were made for me to study my books with this lady's daughter. My music teacher had no small difficulty at first in pinning me down to the notes, but if she played my lessons over for me, I invariably attempted to reproduce the required sounds without the slightest recourse to the written characters. Her daughter, my other teacher, also had her worries. She found that in reading, whenever I came to words that were difficult or unfamiliar, I was prone to bring my imagination to the rescue and read from the picture. She has laughingly told me since then that I would sometimes substitute whole sentences and even paragraphs from that meaning, from what meaning I thought the illustrations conveyed. She said she sometimes was not only amused at the fresh treatment I would give an author's subject, but that when I gave some new and sudden turn to the plot of the story, she often grew interested and even excited in listening to hear what kind of a denouement I would bring about. But I'm sure this was not due to dullness, for I made rapid progress in both my music and my books. Sorry, I apologize. Hey, The Rock, sorry. How are you doing? Glad you could join me. I apologize you came in on me clearing my throat. And for a couple of years, my life was divided between my music and my school books. Music took up the greater part of my time. I had no playmates, but amused myself with games, some of them my own invention, which could be played alone. I knew a few boys whom I had met at the church which I attended with my mother, but I had formed no close friendships with any of them. Then, when I was 9 years old, my mother decided to enter me in the private school, so all at once I found myself thrown among a crowd of boys of all sizes and kinds. Some of them seemed to me like savages. I shall never forget the bewilderment, the pain, the heart-sickness of that first day at school. I seemed to be the only stranger in the place. Every other boy seemed to know every other boy. I was fortunate enough, however, to be assigned to a teacher who knew me. My mother made her dresses. She was one of the ladies who used to pat me on the head and kiss me. She had the tact to address a few words directly to me. This gave me a certain sort of standing in the class and put me somewhat at ease. Well, I'm doing all right, aside from, the incessant allergies. The wood stoves really bring it out, so. But yeah, the book that I'm reading, I'll just, since you and Nightmare weren't here to hear the little preface that I gave, hang on a second. Oh, sorry, I was just looking at something. This is a book that I read about, how many years ago was that now? 19 years ago? Yeah, about 19 years ago. When I was in college, this was part of my American literature course. And so when it came up as an option to read, I definitely just jumped on it. So, yeah. Glad to hear that you are doing good. Within a few days, I had made one staunch friend, and was on fairly good terms with most of the boys. I was shy of the girls, and remained so even now. A word or look from a pretty woman sets me all a-tremble. This friend I bound to me with hooks of steel in a very simple way. He was a big, awkward boy with a full face of freckles and a head full of very red hair. He was perhaps 14 years of age, that is, 4 or 5 years older than any other boy in the class. His seniority was due to the fact that he had spent twice the required amount of time in several of the preceding classes. I had not been at school many hours before I felt that redhead, as I involuntarily called him, and I were to be friends. I do not doubt that this feeling was strengthened by the fact that I had been quick enough to see that a big, strong boy was a friend to be desired at a public school, and perhaps, in spite of his dullness, Redhead had been able to discern that I could be of service to him. At any rate, there was a simultaneous mutual attraction. The teacher had strung the class promiscuously round the walls of the room for a sort of trial heat of places of rank. When the line was straightened out, I found that by skillful maneuvering I had placed myself third, and had piloted Redhead to the place next to me. The teacher began by giving us to spell the words corresponding to our order in line. Spell first. Spell second. Spell third. I rattled off THIRD, third, in a way which said, "Why don't you give us something hard?" As the words went down the line, I could see how lucky I had been to get a good place together with an easy word. As young as I was, I felt impressed with the unfairness of the whole proceeding when I saw the tail-enders going down before 12th and 20th. And I felt sorry for those who had to spell such words in order to hold a low position. Spell fourth. Redhead, with his hands clutched tightly behind his back, began bravely, FORTH. Like a flash, a score of hands went up, and the teacher began saying, "No snapping of fingers, no snapping of fingers." This was the first word missed, and it seemed to me that some of the scholars were about to lose their senses. Some were dancing up and down on one foot with a hand above their heads, the fingers working furiously, and joy beaming all over their faces. Others stood still, their hands raised not so high, their fingers working less rapidly, and their faces expressing not quite so much happiness. There were still others who did not move nor raise their hands, but stood with great wrinkles on their foreheads, looking very thoughtful. The whole thing was new to me, and I did not raise my hand, but slyly whispered the letter U to forehead several times. "Second chance," said the teacher. The hands went down, and the class became quiet. Redhead, his face now red, After looking beseechingly at the ceiling, then pitiably at the floor, began very haltingly, "If you..." Immediately an impulse to raise hands went through the class, but the teacher checked it, and poor Redhead, though he knew that each letter he added only took him further out of the way, went doggedly on and finished RTH. The hand-raising was now repeated with more hubbub and excitement than at first. Those who before had not moved a finger were now waving their hands above their heads. Redhead felt that he was lost. He looked very big and foolish, and some of the scholars began to snicker. His helpless condition went straight to my heart and gripped my sympathies. I felt that if he failed, it would in some way be my failure. I raised my hand, and under cover of the excitement, the teacher's attempts, to regain order. I hurriedly shot up into his ear twice, quite distinctly, "F-O-U-R-T-H, F-O-U-R-T-H. The teacher tapped on her desk and said, "Third and last chance." The hands came down. The silence became oppressive. Redhead began, "F." Since that day I have waited anxiously for many a turn of the wheel of fortune, but never under greater tension than I watched for the order in which those letters would fall from Red's lips. O-U-R-T-H. A sigh of relief and disappointment went up from the class. Afterwards, through all our school days, Redhead shared my wit and quickness, and I benefited by his strength and dogged faithfulness. There were some black and brown boys and girls in the school, and several of them were in my class. One of the boys strongly attracted my attention for the first day I saw him. His face was as black as night, but shone as though it was polished. He had sparkling eyes, and when he opened his mouth he displayed glistening white teeth. It struck me at once as appropriate to call him Shiny Face, or Shiny Eyes, or Shiny Teeth, and I spoke of him often by one of these names to the other boys. These terms were finally merged into Shiny, and to that name he answered good-naturedly during the balance of his public school days. Shiny was considered without question to be the best speller, the best reader, the best penman, in a word, the best scholar in the class. He was very quick to catch anything, but nevertheless studied hard. Thus he possessed two powers, very rarely combined in one boy. I saw him year after year, up into the high school, win the majority of the prizes for punctuality, deportment, easy writing, and declamation. Yet it did not take me long to discover that, in spite of his standing as a scholar, he was in some ways looked down upon. The other black boys and girls were still more looked down upon. Some of the boys often spoke of them as niggers. Sometimes on the way home from the school, a crowd would walk behind them repeating, "Nigger, nigger, never die, black face and shiny eye." On one such afternoon, one of the black boys turned suddenly on his tormentors and hurled a slate. It struck one of the white boys in the mouth, cutting a slight gash in his lips. At sight of the blood, the boy who had thrown the slate ran, and his companions quickly followed. We ran after them, pelting them with stones until they separated in several directions. I was very much wrought up over the affair, and went home and told my mother how one of the niggers had struck a boy with a slate. I shall never forget how she turned on me. "Don't you ever use that word again," she said, "and don't you ever bother colored children at school. You ought to be ashamed of yourself." I did hang my head in shame, but not because she had convinced me that I had done wrong, because I was hurt by the first but because I was hurt by the first sharp word she had ever given me. My school days ran along very pleasantly. I stood well in my studies, not always so well with regard to my behavior. Sorry, the allergies. Where was I? There we go. I was never guilty of any serious misconduct, but my love of fun sometimes got me into trouble. I remember, however, that my sense of humor was so sly that most of the trouble usually fell on the head of the other fellow. My ability to play on the piano at school exercises was looked upon as little short of marvelous in a boy of my age. I was not chummy with many of my mates, but, on the whole, was about as popular as it is good for a boy to be. One day near the end of my my second term at school, the principal came into our room and, after talking to the teacher for some reason, said, "I wish all the white scholars to stand for a moment." I rose with the others. The teacher looked at me and, calling my name, said, "You sit down for the present and rise with the others." I did not quite understand her and questioned, "Ma'am?" She repeated with a softer tone in her voice, "You sit down now and rise with the others." I sat down, dazed. I saw and heard nothing. When the others were asked to rise, I did not know it. When school was dismissed, I went out in a kind of stupor. A few of the white boys jeered at me, saying, "Oh, you're a nigger too." I felt some black children say, "We knew he was colored." Shiny said to them, "Come along, don't tease him," and thereby won my undying gratitude. I hurried on as fast as I could, and had gone some distance before I perceived that Redhead was walking by my side. After a while he said to me, "Let me carry your books." I gave him my strap without being able to answer. When we got to my gate, he said as he handed me my books, "Say, you know my big red agate? I can't shoot with it anymore. I'm going to bring it to school for you tomorrow." "Oh, thank you so much for the bits, UK. Happy Valentine's Day to you, too. I hope you had a good one, though it's the 15th for you now, right? And good morning." Let's see. I'm getting close to the end of the chapter. We'll chat a little bit then. I'll go to the beginning of this paragraph. I hurried on as fast as I could, and had gone some distance before I perceived that Redhead was walking by my side. After a while he said to me, "Let me carry your books." I gave him my strap without being able to answer. When we got to my gate, he said as he handed me my books, "Say, you know my big red agate? I can't shoot with it anymore. I'm going to bring it to school for you tomorrow." The agate that he's referring to is a marble, and the shooter is the big one that you use to knock into the other marbles. I took my books and ran into the house. As I passed through the hallway, I saw that my mother was busy with one of her customers. I rushed up into my own little room, shut the door, and went quickly to where my looking-glass hung on the wall. For an instant I was afraid to look, but when I did, I looked long and earnestly. I had often heard people say to my mother, "What a pretty boy you have." I was accustomed to hear remarks about my beauty, but now, for the first time, I became conscious of it and recognized it. I noticed the ivory whiteness of my skin, the beauty of my mouth, the size and liquid darkness of my eyes, and how the long black lashes that fringed and shaded them produced an effect that was strangely fascinating even to me. I noticed the softness and glossiness of my dark hair that fell in waves over my temples, making my forehead appear whiter than it really was. How long I stood there gazing at my image I do not know. When I came out and reached the head of the stairs, I heard the lady who had been with my mother going out. I ran downstairs and rushed to where my mother was sitting with a piece of work in her hands. I buried my head in her lap and blurted out, "Mother, mother, tell me, am I a nigger?" I could not see her face, but I knew the piece of work dropped to the floor, and I felt her hands on my head. But I looked up into her face and repeated, "Tell me, mother, am I a nigger?" Where there were tears in her eyes, I could see that she was suffering for me. And then it was that I looked into her critically for the first time. I had thought of her in a childish way only as the most beautiful woman in the world. Now I looked at her searching for defects. I could see that her skin was almost brown, that her hair was not so soft as mine, and that she did not differ in some way from the other ladies who came, that she did differ in some ways from the other ladies who came to the house. Yet even so, I could see that she was very beautiful, more beautiful than any of them. She must have felt that I was examining her, for she hid her face in my hair, and said with difficulty, "No, darling, you are not a nigger," she went on. "You are as good as anybody. If anyone calls you a nigger, don't notice them." But the more she talked, the less I was reassured, and I stopped her by asking, "Well, Mother, am I white? Are you white?" She answered tremblingly, "No, I am not white, but you? Your father is one of the greatest men in the country. The best blood of the South is in you." This suddenly opened up in my heart a fresh chasm of misgiving and fear. I almost fiercely demanded, "Who is my father? Where is he?" She stroked my hair and said, "I'll tell you about him one day." I sobbed. "I don't know. I want to know now." She answered, "No, not now." Perhaps it had to be done, but I have never given the woman who did it so cruelly. It may be that she never knew that she gave me a sword thrust that day in school, which was years in healing. I'm going to put up Maestro and get caught up in chat. No worries. You don't need to apologize for interrupting the story. Oh, and thank you so much for the background. I should have put the content warning up for when I did Frederick Douglass's novel, but for some reason I didn't think to do it. But it's nice to have this there, so, I don't have to stop and explain. Yes, they do use these terms and phrases, and there is difficult situations, but, that was life as they knew it, and they wanted to express that to the reader. Oh. Yay. All right. Shall we continue? I was noticing before I started the stream that he is wearing a tuxedo as well as Maestro. So we've got two tuxie guys here. Let's hide Maestro and continue. Chapter 2. Since I have grown older, I have often gone back and tried to analyze the change that came into my life after that fateful day in school. There did come a radical change, and young as I was, I felt fully conscious of it, though I did not fully comprehend it. Like my first spanking, it is one of the few incidents in my life that I can remember clearly. In the life of everyone, there is a limited number of unhappy experiences, which are not written upon the memory, but stamped there with a die. And in long years after, they can be called up in detail, and every emotion that was stirred by them can be lived through anew. These are the tragedies of life. We may grow to include some of them among the trivial incidents of childhood: a broken toy, a promise made to us which was not kept, a harsh, heart-piercing word. But these, too, as well as the bitter experiences and disappointments of mature years, are the tragedies of life. And so I have often lived through that hour, that day, that week in which was wrought the miracle of my transition from one world into another. For I did indeed pass into another world. From that time I looked out through other eyes. My thoughts were colored, my words dictated, my actions limited by one dominating, all-pervading idea, which constantly increased my force and weight until I finally realized in it a great tangible fact. And this is the dwarfing, warping, distorting influence which operates upon each colored man in the United States. He is forced to take his outlook on all things, not from the viewpoint of a citizen or a man, nor even a human being, but from the viewpoint of a colored man. It is wonderful to me that the race has progressed so broadly as it has, since most of its thoughts and all of its activity must run through the narrow neck of one funnel. And it is this, too, which makes the colored people of this country, in reality, a mystery to the whites. It is a difficult thing for a white man to learn what a colored man really thinks, because generally, with the latter in additional and different light, must be brought to bear on what he thinks. And his thoughts are often influenced by considerations so delicate and subtle that it would be impossible for him to confess or explain them to one of the opposite race. This gives to every colored man, in proportion to his intellectuality, a sort of dual personality. There is one phase of him which is disclosed only in the Freemasonry of his own race. I have often watched with interest and sometimes with amazement even ignorant colored men under cover of broad grins and minstrel antics maintain this dualism in the presence of white men. I believe it is to be the fact that the colored person of this country know and understand the white people better than the white people know and understand them. I now think that this change which came into my life was at first more subjective than objective. I do not think my friends at school changed so much towards me as I did towards them. I grew reserved. I might say suspicious. I grew constantly more and more afraid of laying myself open to some injury to my feelings or my pride. I frequently saw and fancied some slight where I am sure none was intended. On the other hand, my friends and teachers were, if anything different, more considerate of me, but I can remember that it was against this very attitude in particular that my sensitiveness revolted. Red was the only one who did not so wound me. Up to this day I recall with a swelling heart his clumsy efforts to make me understand that nothing could change his love for me. I am sure that at this time the majority of my white schoolmates did not understand or appreciate any differences between me and themselves, but there were a few who had evidently received instructions at home on the matter, and more than once they displayed their knowledge in word and action. As the years passed, I noticed that the most innocent and ignorant among the others grew in wisdom. I myself would not have so clearly understood this difference had it not been for the presence of the other colored children at school. I had learned that what their status was, and now I learned that theirs was mine. I had had no particular like or dislike for these black and brown boys and girls. In fact, with the exception of Shiny, they had occupied very little of my thoughts, so I do not know that when the blow fell, I had a very strong aversion to being classed with them. So I became something of a solitary. Sorry, I don't know why I'm having words with today. So I became something of a solitary. Red and I remained inseparable, and there was between Shiny and me a sort of sympathetic bond. But my intercourse with the others was never entirely free from a feeling of constraint. But I must add that this feeling was confined almost entirely to my intercourse with boys and girls of about my own age. I did not experience it with any seniors, and when I grew to manhood I found myself freer with elderly white people than with those near my own age. I was now about 11 years old, but these emotions and impressions which I have just described would not have been stronger or more distinct at an older age. There were two immediate results of my forced loneliness. I began to find company in books and greater pleasure in music. I made the former discovery through a big, gilt-bound illustrated copy of the Bible, which used to lie in splendid neglect on the center table in our little parlor. On top of the Bible lay a photograph album. I had often looked at the pictures in the album, and one day after taking the larger book down and opening it on the floor, I was overjoyed to find that it contained what seemed to be an inexhaustible supply of pictures. I looked at these pictures many times, in fact, so often that I knew the story of each one without having to read the subject, and then, somehow, I picked up the thread of history on which is strung the trials and tribulations of the Hebrew children. This I followed with feverish interest and excitement. For a long time, King David, with Samson a close second, stood at the head of my list of heroes. He was not displaced until I came to know Robert the Bruce. I read a good portion of the Old Testament, all that part treating of wars and rumors of war, and then started in on the New. I became interested in the life of Christ, but became impatient and disappointed when I found out that, notwithstanding the great power he possessed, he did not make use of it when, in my judgment, he most needed to do so. And in my first general impression of the Bible was that my later impression had been of a number of modern books, that the authors put their best work in the first place, and grew either exhausted or careless towards the end. After reading the Bible, or those parts which held my attention, I began to explore the glass-doored bookcase which I have already mentioned. I found there Pilgrim's Progress, Peter Parley's History of the United States, Grimm's Household Stories, Tales of a Grandfather, a bound volume of an old English publication, I think it was called The Mirror, a little volume called Familiar Science, and somebody's Natural Theology, which later, of course, I could not read, but which nevertheless I tackled with the result of gaining a permanent dislike for all kinds of theology. Natural theology. There were several other books of no particular name or merit, such as Agents Sell to People Who Know Nothing of Buying Books. How my mother came by this little library, which, considering all things, was so well suited to me, I never sought to know. But she was far from being an ignorant woman, and had herself, very likely, read the majority of these books, though I do not remember ever having seen her with a book in her hand, with the exception of the Episcopal Prayer Book. At any rate, she encouraged in me the habit of reading, and when I had been about exhausted these books in the little library which interested me, she began to buy books for me. She also regularly gave me money to buy a weekly paper, which was then very popular for boys. At this time I went in for music, with an earnestness worthy of maturer years. A change of teachers was largely responsible for this. I began now to take lessons of the organist of the church, which I attended with my mother. He was a good teacher and quite a thorough musician. He was so skillful in his instruction, and filled me with such enthusiasm, that my progress, these are his words, was marvelous. I remember that when I was barely 12 years old, I appeared on a program with a number of adults at an entertainment given for some charitable purpose, and carried off the honors. I did more. I brought upon myself through the local newspaper the handicapping title of Infant Prodigy. I can believe that I did astonish my audience, for I never played the piano like a child, that is, in the 1-2-3 style with accelerated motion. Neither did I depend upon mere brilliancy of technique. Oh, yeah, I think it is supposed to be technique, but they spell it differently. Technic, as opposed to Que. A trick by which children often surprise their listeners, but I always tried to interpret a piece of music. I always played with feeling. Very early I acquired that knack of using the pedals, which makes the piano a sympathetic singing instrument, quite a different thing from the source of hard or blurred sounds it so generally is. I think this was due not entirely to natural artistic temperament, but largely to the fact that I did not begin to learn the piano by counting out exercises, but by trying to reproduce the quaint songs which my mother used to sing, with all their pathetic turns and cadences. Even at a tender age, in playing, I helped to express what I felt by some of the mannerisms which I afterwards observed in great performers. I had not copied them. I have often heard people speak of the mannerisms of musicians as affectations adopted for mere effect. In some cases, this may be so, but a true artist can no more play upon the piano or violin without putting his whole body in accord with the emotions he is striving to express than a swallow can fly without being graceful. Often when playing, I could not keep the tears which formed in my eyes from rolling down my cheeks. Sometimes at the end of even in the midst of a composition, as big a boy as I was, I would jump up from the piano and throw myself sobbing into my mother's arms. She, by her caresses and often her tears, only encouraged these fits of sentimental hysteria. Of course, to counteract this tendency to temperamental excesses, I should have been out playing ball or in swimming with other boys of my age, but my mother didn't know that. There was only once when she was really firm with me, making me do what she considered was best. I do not want to return to school after the unpleasant episode which I have related, and she was inflexible. I began my third term, and the days ran along as I have already indicated. I had been promoted twice, and had managed each time to pull Red along with me. I think the teachers came to consider me the only hope of his ever getting through school, and I believe they secretly considered with me to bring about the desired end. Oh, I believe that they secretly conspired with me to bring about this desired end. At any rate, I know it became easier in each succeeding examination for me, not only to assist Red, but absolutely to do his work. It is strange how in some things honest people can be dishonest without the slightest compunction. I knew boys at school who were too honorable to tell a fib, even when one would would have been just the right thing, but could not resist the temptation to assist or receive assistance in an examination. I have long considered it the highest proof of honesty in a man to hand his streetcar fare to the conductor who had overlooked it. One afternoon after school, during my third term, I rushed home in a great hurry to get to my dinner and go to my music teacher's. I was never reluctant about going there, but on this particular afternoon I was impetuous. The reason was this. I had been asked to play the accompaniment for a young lady who was to play a violin solo at a concert given by the young people of the church, and on this afternoon we were to have our first rehearsal. At that time, playing accompaniments was the only thing in music I did not enjoy. Later, this feeling grew into positive dislike. I have never been a really good accompanist, because my ideas of interpretation were always too strongly individual. I constantly forced my accelerandos and rubatos upon the soloist, often throwing the duet entirely out of gear. Perhaps the reader has already guessed why I was so willing and anxious to play the accompaniment of this violin solo. If not, the violinist was a girl of 17 or 18, whom I had first heard play a short time before on a Sunday afternoon at a special service of some kind, and who had moved me to a degree which now I can hardly think of as possible. At present, I do not think it was due to her wonderful playing, though I judge she must have been a very fair performer. but there was just the proper setting to produce the effect upon a boy such as I was. The half-dim church, the air of devotion on the part of the listeners, the heaving tremor of the organ under the clear wail of the violin, and she, her eyes almost closing, the escaping strands of her dark hair wildly framing her pale face, and her slender body swaying to the tones she called forth, all combined to fire my imagination and my heart with a passion, though boyish, yet strong and somehow lasting. I have tried to describe the scene. If I have succeeded, it is only half success, for words could only partially express what I would wish to convey. Always in recalling that Sunday afternoon, I am subconscious of a faint but distinct fragrance which, like some old memory-awakening perfume, rises and suffuses my whole imagination, inducing a state of reverie so airy as to just evade the powers of expression. She was my first love, and I loved her as only a boy loves. I dreamed of her. I built air castles for her. She was the incarnation of each beautiful heroine I knew. When I played the piano, it was to her. Not even did music furnish an adequate outlet for my passion. I brought a new notebook, and to sing her praises made my first and last attempts at poetry. I remember one day at school, after having given in our notebooks to have some exercises corrected, the teacher called me to her desk and said, "I couldn't correct your exercises because I found nothing in your book but a rhapsody on somebody's brown eyes." I had passed in the wrong notebook. I don't think I have felt greater embarrassment in my whole life than I did at that moment. I was not only ashamed that my teacher should see this nakedness of my heart, but that she should find out that I had any knowledge of such affairs. It did not then occur to me to be ashamed of the kind of poetry I had written. That's kind of a little funny to me that it is the first and last poetry that the character has written, because the author was quite a prolific poet. Very, very famous for his poetry. Of course, the reader must know that all of this adoration was no secret. Next to my great love for this young lady was the dread that in some way she would find it out. I did not know what some men never find out, that the woman who cannot discern when she is loved has never lived. It makes me laugh to think how successful I was in concealing it all. Within a short time after our duet, all of the friends of my dear one were referring to me as her little sweetheart or her little beau, and she laughingly encouraged it. This did not entirely satisfy me. I wanted to be taken seriously. I had definitely made up my mind that I should never love another woman, and that if she deceived me, I should do something desperate. The great difficulty was to think of something sufficiently desperate, and the heartless jade, how she led me on! So I hurried home that afternoon, humming snatches of the violin part of the duet, my heart beating with pleasurable excitement over the fact that I was going to be near her, to have her attention placed directly upon me, that I was going to be of service to her, and in a way in which I should show myself to advantage. This last consideration was much to do with cheerful service. The anticipation produced in me a sensation somewhat between bliss and fear. I rushed through the gate, took the 3 steps to the house at one bound, threw open the door, and was about to hang my cap on its accompanied peg of the wall rack, when I noticed that that particular peg was occupied by a black derby hat. I stopped suddenly and gazed at this hat as though I had never seen an object of its description. I was still looking at it in open-eyed wonder when my mother, coming out of the parlor into the hallway, called me and said there was someone inside who wanted to see me. Feeling that I was being made a party to some kind of mystery, I went in with her, and there I saw a man standing leaning standing leaning with one elbow on the mantel, his back partly turned toward the door. As I entered, he turned, and I saw a tall, handsome, well-dressed gentleman of perhaps 35. He advanced a step toward me with a smile on his face. I stopped and looked at him with the same feeling with which I had looked at the derby hat, except that they were generally magnified. I looked at him from head to foot, but he was an absolute blank to me until my eyes rested on his slender, elegant, polished shoes. When it seemed that indistinct and partially obliterated films of memory began to first slowly, then rapidly, to unroll, forming a vague panorama of my childhood days in Georgia. My mother broke the spell by calling me by my name and saying, "This is your father." Father. Father. That was the word which had been to me a source of doubt and perplexity ever since the interview with my mother on the subject. How often I had wondered about my father, who he was, what he was like, whether alive or dead, and above all, why she would not tell me about it. More than once I had been on the point of recalling to her the promise she had made me, but I instinctively felt that she was happier for not telling me, and that I was happier for not being told. Yet I had not the slightest idea what the real truth was, and here he stood before me, just the kind of looking father I had wishfully pictured him to be. But I made no advances toward him. I stood there feeling embarrassed and foolish, not knowing what to do or say. I'm not sure, but that he felt pretty much the same. My mother stood by my side with one hand on my shoulder, almost pushing me forward, but I did not move. I can well remember the look of disappointment, even pain, on her face, and I can now understand that she could expect nothing else but that at the name Father I should throw myself into his arms. But I could not rise to this dramatic, or better, melodramatic climax. Somehow I could not arouse any considerable feeling of need for a father. He broke the awkward tableau by saying, "Well, boy, aren't you glad to see me?" He evidently meant the words kindly enough, but I don't know what he could have said that would have had a worse effect. However, my good breeding came to my rescue, and I answered, "Yes, sir," and went to him and offered him my hand. He took my hand into one of his, and with the other stroked my hand, saying that I had grown into a fine youngster. He asked me how old I was, which, of course, he must have done merely to say something more, or perhaps he did so as a test of my intelligence. I replied, 12, sir." He then made the trite observation about the flight of time, and we lapsed into another awkward pause. My mother was all in smiles. I believe that was one of the happiest moments of her life. Either to put me more at ease or to show me off, she asked me to play something for my father. There is only one thing in the world that can take music, at all times and under all circumstances, up to its general standard. That is a hand organ, or one of its variations. I went to the piano and played something in a listless, half-hearted way. I simply was not in the mood. I was wondering, while playing, when my mother would dismiss me and let me go, but my father was so enthusiastic in his praise that he touched my vanity, which was great, and more than that, he displayed that sincere appreciation which always arouses an artist to his best effort, and, too, in an unexplainable manner, makes him feel like shedding tears. I showed my gratitude by playing for him a Chopin waltz with all the feeling that was in me. When I had finished, my mother's eyes were glistening with tears. My father stepped across the room, seized me in his arms, and squeezed me to his breast. I am certain that for that moment he was proud to be my father. He sat and held me standing between his knees while he talked to my mother. I, in the meantime, examined him with more curiosity, perhaps, than politeness. I interrupted the conversation by asking, "Mother, is he going to stay with us now?" I found it impossible to frame the word father. It was too new to me, so I asked the question through my mother. Without waiting for her to speak, my father answered, "I've got to get back to New York this afternoon, but I'm coming to see you again." I turned abruptly and went over to my mother, and almost in a whisper reminded her that I had an appointment which I should not miss. To my pleasant surprise, she said that she would give me something to eat at once so that I might go. Sorry, just got distracted. She went out to the room, and I began to gather from off the piano the music I needed. When I had finished, my father, who had been watching me, asked, "Are you going?" I replied, "Yes, sir, I've got to go to practice for a concert." He spoke some words of advice to me about being a good boy and taking care of my mother when I grew up, and added that he was going to send me something nice from New York. My mother called, and I said goodbye to him and went out. I saw him only once after that. Backstreet Boys, yeah. I quickly swallowed down what my mother had put on the table for me, seized my cap and music, and hurried off to my teacher's house. On the way I could think of nothing but this new father, where he came from, where he had been, why he was here, and why he would not stay. In my mind I ran over the whole list of fathers I had become acquainted with in my readings, but I could not classify him. The thought did not cross my mind that he was different from me, and even if it had the mystery, would not thereby have been explained. For notwithstanding my changed relations with most of my schoolmates, I had only a faint knowledge of prejudice, and no idea at all how it ramified and affected the entire social organism. I felt, however, that there was something about the whole affair which had to be hid. When I arrived, I found that she of the brown eyes had been rehearsing with my teacher, and was on the point of leaving. My teacher, with some expression of surprise, asked why I was late. I stammered out the first deliberate lie of which I had any recollection. I told him that when I reached home from school I found my mother quite sick, and that I had stayed with her a while before coming. Then unnecessarily and gratuitously, to give my words force of conviction, I suppose I added, "I don't think she'll be with us very long." In speaking these words, I must have been comical, for I noticed that my teacher, instead of showing signs of anxiety or sorrow, half hid a smile. But how little did I know that in that lie I was speaking a prophecy. She of the brown eyes unpacked her violin, and we went through the duet several times. I was soon lost to all other thoughts in the delights of music and love. I say delights of love without reservation, for at no time of life is love so pure, so delicious, so poetic, so romantic as it is in boyhood. A great deal has been said about the heart of a girl when she stands where the brook and river meet, but what she feels is negative. More interesting is the heart of a boy when just at the bubbling dawn of manhood he stands looking wide-eyed into the long vistas opening before him, when he first becomes conscious of the awakening and quickening of strange desires and unknown powers, when what he sees and feels is still shadowy and mystical enough to be intangible, and so more beautiful, when his imagination is unsullied and his faith new and whole, then it is that love wears a halo. The man who has not loved before he was 14 has missed a foretaste of Elysium. When I reached home it was quite dark, and I found my mother without a light, sitting rocking in a chair, as she so often used to do in my childhood days, looking into the fire and singing softly to herself. I nestled close to her, and with her arms around me, she haltingly told me who my father was. a great man, a fine gentleman. He loved me and loved her very much. He was going to make a great man of me. All she said was so limited by reserve and so colored by her feelings that it was but half truth, and so I did not yet fully understand. I'm not really sure. I think probably the no poetry thing was more to show the embarrassing, wholehearted, like lovesick part of adolescence. You know, the cringeworthy things of, oh, my first crush, and I wrote a song and it was horrible and I never sang again. Sort of that thing. Hey, Corel, glad you could make it. I still have one more chapter to go. It looks like it's, these are long, long chapters. Oh, I'm so sorry, Kicken. I don't know why it keeps timing you out. Nightbot is a bully. I'm not really sure. I tried to figure out how to get that to stop being cranky about people who do a lot of emotes. Oh, yeah. Grr. Those are such cute emotes. Hang on just a second. I think that's somebody... Okay. Hey, there we go. There's that squid. Why, Nightbot? Why? Nightbot. How can I get that to stop doing that? Corel or Yuka, is there possibly, if I'm gonna put Maestro back up there. There we go. If there is a way to possibly get Nightbot to chill out. I'm not really sure how. So if you could possibly find out and let me know how I can do that, or if you can do that, that would be amazing. Thank you so much, Corel. I don't know, maybe I have something turned off that I need to turn on, or the vice versa. Oh no, why couldn't you do it? So welcome back, Kickin'. There we go, just wanted to move that through the thing. All right, shall we continue? Here we go. Chapter 3. Perhaps I ought not pass on this narrative without mentioning that the duet was a great success. So great that we were obliged to respond with 2 encores. It seemed to me that life could hold no greater joy than it contained when I took her hand and we stepped down to the front of the stage, bowing to our enthusiastic audience. When we reached the little dressing room where the other performers were applauding as wildly as the audience, she impulsively threw both her arms around me and kissed me while I struggled to get away. One day, a couple of weeks after my father had been to see us, a wagon drove up to our cottage loaded with a big box. I was about to tell the man on the wagon that they had made a mistake when my mother, acting darkly wise, told me to bring their load in. She had them to unpack the box, and quickly she was evolved from the boards, paper, and other packing materials a beautiful, brand new, upright piano. Then she informed me that it was a present to me from my father. I at once sat down and ran my fingers over the keys. The full, mellow tone of the instrument was ravishing. I thought almost remorsefully of how I had left my father, but even so, There momentarily crossed my mind a feeling of disappointment that the piano was not a grand. The new instrument greatly increased the pleasure of my hours of study and practice at home. Shortly after this, I was made a member of the boys' choir, it being found that I possessed a clear, strong soprano voice. I enjoyed the singing very much. About a year later, I began to study of the pipe organ and the theory of music, and before I finished the grammar school, I had written out several simple preludes for organ, which won the admiration of my teacher, and which he did me the honor to play at service. The older I grew, the more thought I gave to the question of my and my mother's position, and what was our exact relation to the world in general. My idea of the whole matter was rather hazy. My study of United States history had been confined to those periods which were designated in my book as discovery, colonial, revolutionary, and constitutional. I now began to study about the Civil War, but the story was told in such a condensed and skipping style that I gained from it very little real information. It is a marvel how children ever learn any history out of the books of that sort. And too, I began now to read the newspapers. I often saw articles which aroused my curiosity, but did not enlighten me. But one day I drew from the circulating library a book that cleared the whole mystery, a book that I read with such same feverish intensity with which I had read the old Bible stories, a book that gave me my first perspective of the life I was entering. The book was Uncle Tom's Cabin. This work was Harriet Beecher Stowe, has been the object of much unfavorable criticism. It has been assailed not only as fiction of the most imaginative sort, but as being a direct misrepresentation. Several successful attempts have lately been made to displace the book from northern school libraries. Its critics would brush it aside with the remark that there never was a Negro as good as Uncle Tom, nor a slaveholder as bad as Legree. For my part, I was never an admirer of Uncle Tom, nor of his type of goodness, but I believed that there were lots of old Negroes as foolishly good as he, the proof of which is that they knowingly stayed and worked the plantations that furnished sinews for the army which was fighting to keep them enslaved. But in these later years, several cases have come to my personal knowledge in which old Negroes have died and left what was a considerable fortune to the descendants of their former masters. I do not think it takes any great stretch of the imagination to believe that there was a fairly large class of slaveholders typified in Legree. And we must also remember that the author depicted a number of worthless, if not vicious, Negroes, and a slaveholder who was as much of a good Christian and a gentleman as it was possible for one in his position to be, that she pictured the happy, singing, shuffling darky as well as the mother waiting for her child sold down river. I do not think it is claiming too much to say that Uncle Tom's Cabin was a fair and truthful panorama of slavery. However that may be, it opened my eyes as to who and what I was, and what my country considered me. In fact, it gave me my bearing. There was no shock. I took the whole revelation in a kind of stoical way. One of the greatest benefits I derived from reading the book was that I could afterwards talk frankly with my mother on all the questions which had been vaguely troubling my mind. As a result, she was entirely freed from reserve, and often herself brought up the subject, talking of things directly touching her life and mine, and of things which had come down to her through the old folks. What she told me interested and even fascinated me, and what may seem strange, kindled in me a strong desire to see the South. She spoke to me quite frankly about herself, my father, and myself. She, the sewing girl of my father's mother; he, an impetuous young man home from college; I, the child of this unsanctioned love. She told me even the principal reason of our coming north. My father was about to be married to a young lady of another great southern family. She did not neglect to add that another reason of our being in Connecticut was that he intended to give me an education and make a man of me. In none of her talks did she ever utter one word of complaint against my father. She always endeavored to impress upon me how good he had been and still was, and that he was all to us that custom and law would allow. She loved him more, she worshipped him, and she died firmly believing that he loved her more than any other woman in the world. Perhaps she was right, who knows? All of these newly awakened ideas and thoughts took the form of a definite aspiration on the day I graduated from the grammar school. And what a day that was! The girls in white dresses with fresh ribbons in their hair, the boys in new suits and creaky shoes, the great crowd of parents and friends, the flowers, the prizes and congratulations made the day seem to me one of the greatest importance. I was on the program and played a piano solo which was received by the audience with that amount of applause which I had come to look upon as being only the just due to my talent. But the real enthusiasm was aroused by Shiny. He was the principal speaker of the day, and well did he measure up to the honor. He made a striking picture, that thin, little black boy standing on the platform dressed in clothes that did not fit him any too well, his eyes burning with excitement, the shrill musical voice vibrating in tones of appealing defiance, and his black face alight with such great intelligence and earnestness as to be positively handsome. What were his thoughts when he stepped forward and looked into that crowd of faces, all white with the expectation of a score or so that were lost to view? I do not know, but I fancy he felt his loneliness. I think there must have rushed over him a feeling akin to that of a gladiator tossed into an arena and bade to fight for his life. I think that solitary little black figure standing there felt that for that particular time and place he bore the weight and responsibility of his race, that for him to fail meant general defeat, but he won, and nobly. His oration was Wendell Phillips' Toussaint l'Ouverture, a speech which may now be classed as rhetorical, even perhaps bombastic, but as the words fell from Shiny's lips their effect was magical. How so young an orator could stir so great enthusiasm was to be wondered at. When in the famous peroration, his voice trembling with the suppressed emotion rose higher and higher, and then rested on the name Toussaint l'Ouverture. It was like touching an electric button, which loosed the pent-up feelings of his listeners. They actually rose to him. I have since known of colored men who have been chosen as class orators in our leading universities, of others who have played on the varsity football and baseball teams, of colored speakers who have addressed great white audiences. In each of these instances, I believed the men who were stirred by the same emotion which actuated Shiny on the day of his graduation, and two, in each case where the efforts have reached any high standard of excellence, they have been followed by the same phenomenon of enthusiasm. I think the explanation of the latter lies in what is a basic, though often dormant, principle of the Anglo-Saxon heart: love of fair play. Shiny, it is true, was what is so common in his race, a natural orator. But I doubt that any white boy of equal talent could have wrought the same effect. The sight of that boy gallantly waging with puny black arms so unequal a battle touched the deep springs in the heart of his audience, and they were swept by a wave of sympathy and admiration. Just really quickly looking at chat. I know it is really hard to listen to that word, UK. It was hard with the Frederick Douglass one as well, the heroic slave. But I didn't have the content warning sign yet, so I decided, like I was thinking of it all last night, that I must put one up so that, if somebody happens upon, they haven't heard my disclaimer before, that they know that I am doing this because he uses it to express what, he and the rest of his community has had to face. So, wanted to respect his wishes to keep those words and, sort of conversations and mannerisms as he has written them. Very, very true, Pete. Yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how I can do that. If if it's something that I do through Streamlabs OBS, or if it's something that I have to do from the dashboard, or the Nightbot website, I would love a hand with that, because I am frustrated that it keeps doing that. Alright, let me continue. Okay, through the Nightbot website. I'm going to pull that up so that I remember to do that. Nightbot. And then we have 3 pages left. There we go. But the effect upon me of Shiny's speech was double. I not only shared the enthusiasm of his audience, but he imparted to me some of his own enthusiasm. I felt leap within me pride that I was colored, and I began to form wild dreams of bringing glory and honor to the Negro race. For days I could think of nothing else with my mother except my ambition to be a great man, a great colored man, to reflect credits on the race and gain fame for myself. It was not until years after that I formulated a definite and feasible plan for realizing my dreams. I entered the high school with my class and still continued my study of the piano, the pipe organ, and the theory of music. I had to drop out of the boys' choir on account of my changing voice. This I regretted very much. As I grew older, my love for reading grew stronger. I read with studious interest everything I could find relating to colored men who had gained prominence. My heroes had been King David, then Robert the Bruce, now Frederick Douglass was enshrined in the place of honor. When I learned that Alexandre Dumas was a colored man, I reread Monte Cristo and the Three Guardsmen with magnified pleasure. I lived between my music and books, on the whole a rather unwholesome life for a boy to lead. I dwelt in a world of imagination, of dreams and air castles, the kind of atmosphere that sometimes nourishes a genius, more often men unfitted for the practical struggles of life. I never played a game of ball, never went fishing or learned to swim. In fact, the only outdoor exercise in which I took any interest was skating. Nevertheless, though slender, I grew well-formed and in perfect health. After I entered the high school, I began to notice the change in my mother's health, which I suppose had been going on for some years. She began to complain a little and to cough a great deal. She tried several remedies and finally went to see a doctor, but though she was failing in health, she kept her spirits up. She still did a great deal of sewing, and in the busy seasons hired 2 women to help her. The purpose she had formed of having me go through college without financial worries kept her at work when she was not fit for it. I was so fortunate as to be able to organize a class of 8 or 10 beginners on the piano, and so start a separate little fund of my own. As the time of my graduation from the high school grew nearer, the plans for my college career became the chief subject of our talks. I sent for catalogs of all the prominent schools in the East and eagerly gathered all the information I could concerning them from different sources. My mother told me that my father wanted me to go to Harvard or Yale. She herself had a half desire for me to go to Atlanta University, and even had me write for a catalog of that school. There were two reasons, however, that inclined her to my father's choice. The first, that at Harvard or Yale I should be near her. The second, that my father had promised to pay a part of my college education. Both Shiny and Red came to my house quite often for evenings, and we used to talk over our plans and prospects for the future. Sometimes I would play for them, and they seemed to enjoy the music very much. My mother often prepared sundry southern dishes for them, which I am not sure but that they enjoyed more. Shiny had an uncle in Amherst, Massachusetts, and he expected to live with him and work his way through Amherst College. Red declared that he had enough of school and that after he got his high school diploma, he would get a position in a bank. It was his ambition to become a banker, and he felt sure of getting the opportunity through certain members of his family. My mother barely had strength to attend the closing exercises of the high school when I graduated, and after that day she was seldom out of bed. She could no longer direct her work, and under the expense of medicines, doctors, and someone to look after her, our college fund began to diminish rapidly. Many of her customers and some of the neighbors were very kind and frequently brought her nourishment of one kind or another. My mother realized what I did not, that she was mortally ill, and she had me write a long letter to my father. For some time past she had heard from him only at irregular intervals. We never received an answer. In those last days, I often sat at her bedside and read to her until she fell asleep. Sometimes I would leave the parlor door open and play on the piano, just loud enough for the music to reach her. This she always enjoyed. One night, near the end of July, after I had been watching beside her for some hours, I went into the parlor and, throwing myself into the big armchair, dozed off into the fitful sleep. I was suddenly roused by one of the neighbors who had come in to sit with her that night. She said, "Come to your mother at once." I hurried upstairs, and at the bedroom door met the woman who was acting as nurse. I noted with a dissolving heart the strange look of awe on her face. From my first glance at my mother, I discerned the light of death upon her countenance. I fell upon my knees beside the bed, and burying my face in the sheets, sobbed convulsively. She died with the fingers of her left hand entwined in my hair. I will not rake over this, one of the two sacred sorrows of my life, nor could I describe the feeling of unutterable loneliness that fell upon me. After the funeral, I went to the house of my music teacher. He had kindly offered me the hospitality of his home for so long as I might need it. A few days later, I moved my trunk, piano, my music, and most of my books to his home. The rest of my books I divided between Shiny and Red. Some of the household effects I gave to Shiny's mother and to 2 or 3 of the neighbors who had been kind to us during my mother's illness. The others I sold. After settling up my little estate, I found that besides a good supply of clothes, a piano, some books, and other trinkets, I had about $200 in cash. The question of what I was to do now confronted me. My teacher suggested a concert tour, but both of us realized that I was too old to be exploited as an infant prodigy and too young and inexperienced to go before the public as a finished artist. He, however, insisted that the people of the town would generously patronize a benefit concert, so took up the matter and made arrangements for such an entertainment. A more than sufficient number of people with musical and elocutionary talent volunteered their services to make a program. Among these was my brown-eyed violinist, but our relations were not the same as they were when we had played our first duet together. A year or so after that time, she had dealt me a crushing blow by getting married. I was partially avenged, however, by the fact that, though she was growing more beautiful, she was losing her ability to play the violin. I was down on the program for one number. My selection might have appeared at that particular time as a bit of affectation, but I considered it deeply appropriate. I played Beethoven's Sonata Pathétique. When I sat down at the piano and glanced into the faces of the several hundreds of people who were there solely on account of love or sympathy for me, emotions swelled in my heart which enabled me to play the Pathétique as I could never again play it. When the last tone died away, the few who began to applaud were hushed by the silence of the others, and for once I played without receiving an encore. The benefit yielded me a little more than $200, thus raising my cash capital to about $400. I still held to my determination of going to college, so it was now a question of trying to squeeze through a year at Harvard or going to Atlanta where the money I had would pay my actual expenses for at least 200 years. 200 years, oh my word. For at least 2 years. The peculiar fascination which the South held over my imagination and my limited capital decided me in favor of Atlantic University, so about the last of September I bade farewell to the friends and scenes of my boyhood and boarded a train for the South. All right, so that is it for story time today, but we have some treats to give to the kitties, so let me go see if I can scrounge up Snockings and Maestro. Oh, but first I have to wake up my foot. It has decided it wants to sleep. That's a delicious hydration. All right, I'll be back in a moment with kitties. Is Snockings in there? Oh, okay. No, we have treat times. I think Maestro will come running when he hears the treat bottle. Alright, here we go. Maestro, come on, pants. Snockings is excited. Here you go, Mr. No, you're not a mister. You're a Miss Butt. There you go. Maestro, come on. Looks like I'm going to have to go and physically grab him. He was really comfy on the back of my chair with my old baby blanket. I love that he loves my baby blanket. All right. Did you finish them? You did. All right. Let me go grab Maestro. That was from Pharrell. Get Pansy. Come on. Nope, she already had her treats. Okay, let's see if he'll actually eat on the desk and give you... Oh, Nancy. Hey, he might actually eat on the desk. Here, yes, right there. This is from Corel. Maestro, you should chew it. Don't just swallow it, my dear. That was all I had, and that was from Corel. Alrighty. Well, let us find somebody to raid. Do any of you have any suggestions or requests? Oh, okay. Goodness. That is really cold, Corel. Right, let us see who is on. We have many people on right now. We have Shiny Wave. It's been a little while since I've rated her. I know, yeah. Closest we have, I think, is Kipsidaisy is doing The Sims, which sometimes those are nice and chill. Shiny Wave is doing Final Fantasy, so it does like have that story type element to it. Other ones. Also, let me see. We've got. We can raid somebody new. Oh yeah, thank you so much for hanging out, Pete and UK and Corel and Kickin'. Everybody for stopping by. I think we will try somebody new. We have Ali Mack is playing Stardew Valley. Oh yes, thank you. I would really appreciate that. All right, yeah. Oops. Let's see. Ali Mack. Okay. All right. So let's get our little raid message ready. And this is the raid message I'll be using. Thank you again. I hope you guys have a good rest of your day or night, whatever time zone you are. Next story time is the Robin Hood one on Tuesday, of course, 2 to 4. And then we will continue with Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man on Thursday. And hopefully this week I can do some gaming streams after. The moment it's still, you know, the pollens are horrible. So here's hoping. All right. See you guys. Have a good one. Bye.
Now with Taco Bell's app, you can build your own $5 cravings box. Because you know what you crave at Taco Bell,